Steve, with the last Leger poll before the election, you were in the field on Tuesday and Wednesday, October 15th and 16th. And so what did you find out?
Well, Harold, it's been an interesting ride, and as we were chatting earlier, it's an exciting election. It's still a close election. We've done 5 waves of polling starting in August, and here's where we've netted out. The NDP is still ahead. It's within the margin of error, but we've seen a couple of polls now where they've been ahead by 3 or 4 points. In this case, 4 points. We've seen very little movement in the case of the Greens the last couple of waves. So on the surface, it looks like things haven't changed week over week, but there's some subtleties within our data that we can talk about in this call.
Okay, yeah. So you say the overall numbers, 46% NDP, 42% Conservatives, 9% Greens. Same for the Greens. I think down 1 for the NDP and then same for the Conservatives. So as you say, basically unchanged. But what are you seeing when you dig deeper into different cohorts?
Yeah, that's where you get the interesting nuances in polling. You've got the NDP has picked up support in Metro Vancouver throughout the campaign, so it's gone from 42% to 49% over a 3-week period, and the Conservatives have solidified their gains in areas outside of BC, and they're currently at 49. So regionally, there's always been the story, very different outcomes to an election. The other thing that's happened is swings in age groups. And what's happened in the last 3 weeks is that the voters over 55 have opened up a 13-point margin over the Conservative support. So it's 51 to 37. So that's the highest it's ever been. The other thing that's happened is that Conservative support, we talked a couple of weeks ago that John Rustad was doing fairly well among youth as well as females, which traditionally was not his turf. And then after things heated up in the campaign, we saw that there was a drastic drop in support among those two groups, sort of back to the norm. This past week, we've seen a bit of a moderation of that, and they've come back up a little bit. But still, the gap from where he started in the campaign with those two groups has really stalled. And that's primarily the reason for the switch in the lead. 3 weeks ago, we were saying, wow, the Conservatives have a 2-point lead. Well, that's evaporated primarily because of the 18 to 34 and the female vote across BC.
Yeah, it is quite shocking to see that 55 plus number. That's certainly one that jumped out at me. What is it, as you say, 51% to 37%,
Mhm.
and for the NDP, and then the NDP is still way ahead with women. But I mean, I guess maybe it's within the margins, but the Conservatives closed the gap a little bit with women.
A little bit, yeah. We still have probably a little bit higher support among female voters than what we would typically see in this type of a party. So they've done a pretty good job overall. Probably the
Okay.
most interesting thing, Harold, when I look at the data, is when we compare the past vote to this vote. And so look at the 2020 election and ask people what they voted then versus what they voted now. And the fascinating thing to me is this. If you look at Liberal voters from 2020, only 2/3 of those are voting Conservative this time around. So that's a pretty big loss. Earlier in the campaign, I think throughout the summer, a lot of the political analysts were saying, well, it's almost a no-brainer. If you're the Liberal Party, you're going to vote for a Conservative Party. And as we saw the decline of United with the brand change, we saw that it was not an automatic thing. So here we are at the end of the day. If the Conservatives lose this election, it'll be because they didn't garnish enough support from the past, right-wing party that was, in place in BC.
Interesting. So go back to that for a moment again. So say 2/3 of people who voted Liberal last time say they're voting Conservative this time.
Yeah, so that means a loss. 28% of Liberal voters last time are going to the NDP and 4% to the Greens. So they've primarily switched over to NDP. Now, the NDP has had a similar story, but not quite as extreme. So we've got 75% of NDP supporters retaining their vote and staying with the same party they picked 4 years ago, and 19% moving over to the Conservatives. So but the leak in the Conservative vote from the Liberal vote to Conservative was not as big as the leak from the NDP to the Conservative. So in a nutshell, the NDP didn't lose as many as what the Liberals lost, and that's where we are.
Okay, interesting. You mentioned also geographically that what is now an 8-point gap between the NDP and the Conservatives in Metro Vancouver, 49% to 41%. I think this is where the Conservatives were hoping to make significant gains, particularly in the suburbs. I guess it's too fine of a detail to figure out where that vote is. Like obviously if it's
Exactly.
49 to
What is
41 in
there?
the suburbs, yeah.
There's a lot of
Yeah.
ridings in Metro Vancouver, and a lot of them are entrenched in their support. I look at my own riding; it's been solid NDP for 3 years. The odds of them losing that seat are pretty slim, but on some of those ridings that are a little bit closer, it'll be a different story. And that's the interesting thing about polling that we can't predict. We're doing polls at a regional level, provincial level, but riding by riding is almost impossible to do. You just need such a massive sample size. So that's where the nuances come into play, is how much the NDP wins and what margins in those kind of secure ridings versus what the Conservatives do on those the ridings that are a little bit closer.
Right. And then you have this other variable this year with a large number. I know it doesn't show up much in the polls, but there's a large number of independents running who maybe were either BC United candidates or former Liberal MLAs in a couple of prominent cases.
Yeah, that's an
Um,
interesting number, and our poll results don't really show that. Now, what's historically happened is we typically find polls overrepresent the other, and what happens is people get to the polling booth, or they look at what's the potential for somebody to win the riding, and sometimes they do strategic voting and last minute switches. So typically the numbers are lower than what are stated in our polls. In this case, I think the 3% will hold, and it's still a fraction. We have a handful of ridings where there's recognizable brand names of people
right.
who have been past mayors or past cabinet ministers. Yeah, those will steal some votes, but they're in small ridings, populations that have small ridings, and collectively they won't add up to really sway this election.
The other figure you have in there is you had 30% of the people, or 37% of the people said they'd already voted. Can you recall, is that a high number?
Well,
About the
I've never
same?
seen it that high. Now, we even question ourselves because that is higher than what the numbers are showing provincially. Now, they don't release them every day. So the last number I saw was the advanced polling, I think a couple of days ago, had 24%, and we're showing 37. So we overrepresent. And typically panels and polls, they tend to overrepresent the very enthusiastic voters, the people who really show up. So still, the caveat with that being said, it still is a record turnout. It will show up as a record turnout. I think that's a legacy of, the COVID elections that we've held, where people are used to remote voting and advanced voting and want to avoid the lineups. And in fact, when you look at the demographics of those who are advanced voting, it's almost exclusively 55 plus. Half, according to our poll, of 55 plus age group have shown up to vote, and it's only 23% of 18 to 34-year-olds. So those numbers will balance out. And right now, if you look at those who have already voted, yes, the NDP has a slight lead, but that's not surprising given what I said earlier about the 55 plus crowd. So we'll see that even out, and the election will be closer than what the advanced polling is indicating right now.
Okay. So this doesn't tell you what the seat count is going to be, but would you venture a guess? Here we are a couple of days from the election.
Well, we do. Luckily, Leger has a pretty fantastic track record, and you mentioned that in the last election we were within just 1 point on all the votes. So, but since we're within the margin of error, I can't conclusively say that I'm going to pick a winner. I mean, the NDP has shown that they've been resilient. They've rebounded from their lows of a couple of weeks ago. They have a couple of positive things going. They have strong support among the voting group that turns out in greater numbers than anybody else, the 55 plus. They're polling strongly in Metro Vancouver. The premier approval ratings of EB are higher than Rustad, and the debate was won. So there's a bunch of other indicators besides our close horse race numbers that suggest that EB will likely take this election, with the caveat that it all comes down to who shows up. Last provincial election we had, I think it was 56% voter turnout. We expect, I think, a little bit higher than that this time around because it was still, coming out of COVID. So we should see some higher numbers, and it's a closer election. And as I say, it depends who shows up. If the 18 to 34-year-olds show up more than what they usually do, and last provincial election was 42%, and if they show up to the tune of 52%, we could see them sway this election. If it's just 55 plus that determine the outcome, then they could be attributed to, swaying those 2 or 3 points that will make a majority. So when you ask who will win, I'd say I lean towards the NDP, but it always comes down to who shows up in the riding on election day. And Christy Clark said it well back in 2013 when she won. She said the real true poll results are the ones at the polling station on election day, and our polls are a great indicator, but not the conclusive one. So we'll leave it at that.
Okay. And then, of course, to top it all off, the forecast is for an atmospheric river and high winds. So that might also deter people from going out to the polls.
Well, if you've already got 34% turnout, maybe people will get out today as the sun is shining, and will, election day will just be the half of the electorate.
Let's hope so. Let's hope everybody gets out to vote this weekend, and maybe we'll check in after the election, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's see how it all shakes out. I'll be watching, as I'm sure you will, waiting and waiting for those results as they roll in around 7 or 8 o'clock on Saturday.
All right. Thanks. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Harold. It's a pleasure.